Lieutenant Donald R. Green, son of Ray and Bonnie Green of Sanborn, Indiana, was shot down January 3, 1943 in a raid over France. Lieutenant Green was first reported missing in action, but later his death was corroborated by the American Red Cross through contact with Red Cross in Germany. This information was that Lieutenant Green, a navigator on a U.S. plane, was killed when a plane was shot down during a raid over France. 2 members of the ship survived. Earl Harper, 23, private first class, fourth son of Mr. and Mrs. William A. Harper of 809 Emerson Avenue, died January 29th of wounds received in action in the defense of his country in North Africa. According to a telegram from the War Department by the parents, the telegram said that no details are yet available, but the parents will be given full information by letter as soon as received by the War Department. Young Harper entered the service January 21st, 1942, a few weeks after the sneaker raid by the Japs on Pearl Harbor. He had previously been at a government CCC camp in Michigan for 2 years. The last information as to his attachment in the Army was that he was in an ordnance department. Parents had received a letter from their son. He seemed in excellent spirits at the time, and as in other letters, appeared glad to be in the Army. He had previously sent pictures back home, one picture showing Private Harper with a group of other Americans mounted on horses in front of one of the pyramids in Egypt. Standing on the ground in front of the mounted soldier was a group of natives. I knew he was in Africa when we received that picture, Miss Harper told a press representative. The parents said their son has sent them numerous pictures showing different camps where he has been stationed. It is war, and some mother's sons must pay the sacrifice, Miss Harper declared bravely as she recalled she has 3 sons in the service, all yet in this country so far as she has been informed. Conrad Adams, son of Mr. and Mrs. Eula Adams, who was reported in a telegram received by the parents to have died in the service in the South Pacific, died on a hospital boat on his way to Australia, according to a letter received Saturday by his parents. The letter was from Major Ernest Elliott, base section chaplain. He was buried with full military honors, according to the letter. No particulars to the cause of death were given in the letter. Tribute paid to Colonel Virgil Elkenberry. Vincennes school children and teachers of the Vincennes City School Corporation pay tribute to the memory of Lieutenant Colonel Virgil L. Elkenberry, former superintendent of the city schools, who died December 26 at the military hospital at George Field, Illinois, after an illness of 2 weeks. Colonel Elkenberry, who took a leave of absence on May 5, 1942 to enter active service in the Army, was stricken while en route to Camp Breckinridge, Kentucky, to a new assignment. The memorial, a large color portrait of Colonel Elkenberry, has been placed in the first floor hall of Clark Junior High School building immediately in front of the 6th Street entrance, along with a plaque bearing the names of teachers, husbands, and sons of teachers or other persons connected with the city school system who are in the armed forces. Beneath Colonel Elkenberry's picture is an inscription, "To live in the hearts of those we leave behind is not to die," and his name and rank beneath which is inscribed, "Educator, Civic Leader, Patriot." Colonel Elkenberry had been associated with the Vincennes City Schools since 1924. Coming here as principal of the high school, 5 years later he became superintendent of the city schools. Taking a leave of absence from that position last May 5th to enter the Army, he served as an officer overseas in World War I and enlisted in the Officers Reserve Corps following the war. He served in the Indiana National Guard before coming to Vincennes and maintained his military connections, attending many of the reserve officers' camps. He was active in Vincennes civic life, being active in the Kiwanis Club, of which he was immediate past president and past president of the Vincennes Chamber of Commerce. He was county defense director immediately before entering active service and was first county chairman of the war bonds. The large plaque hangs on the other side of the clock from Colonel Elkenberry's portrait. The list of names is headed by Colonel Elkenberry's name, after which is a gold star. Other names are Charles E. Steinsberger, Robert Vetz, Joseph D. Kurtz, George Richardville, Paul Richardville, Richard Schulte, Clarence Stout Jr., Robert Hahn, John Adams Jr., George M. Weinkauf, Robert Track, Robert McCormick, Morris Inley, Hugh Delvin, Hobart Hancock, and Paul Pruitt. Charles Harris of Vincennes was first reported missing and a captive of the Japanese Empire. But Mr. and Mrs. Sam Harris, Vincennes, now know just how cruel war and its consequences can be. Several months ago, they were informed that their son Charles, who was stationed in the Philippines when war broke out, was missing in action. Mr. Harris, a veteran of the First World War, declared vengeance and joined the Navy Seabees to do his bit toward punishing the nation's enemies for the loss of his son. A younger brother of Charles, John Harris, also entered the service. Then came a new hope to the Harris family. The War Department reported that Charles was a prisoner of the Japanese, having been captured at the fall of Bataan. However, Mr. Harris and his other son continued training for the service of their country. Mr. and Mrs. Harris were informed that Charles was dead, that he had died while a prisoner of the Japanese. PSC Alfred Holloman dies in Germany. Miss Mary Holloman, 618 State Street, received word Friday that her husband, PSC Alfred Holloman, was killed September 2nd in a motor vehicle somewhere in Germany while in maneuvers. Details of his death will be sent later by the Secretary of State. However, no other information was ever received on PSC Holloman's death in Germany. Alfred D. Holloman was a member of the 645th Tank Destroyer Battalion. He was born January 10, 1922, died September 2, 1945. Harry L. Fraker entered the United States Army in 1942. Having served overseas for 2 years, he is the brother of Miss Jo Myers of 1320 Prairie Street. Staff Sergeant Fraker was inducted in 1941 and was stationed at the Field Artillery Replacement Center, Fort Bragg, North Carolina, until July of 1944, when he was transferred to the infantry and sent to Newark, Guinea. His wife, Myra Pickering Fraker, and their little daughter, Sandra Sue, reside in Evansville. Harry Fraker was killed in action. Private Joseph A. Dawson, prisoner in a Japanese prison camp since the fall of Bataan on April 10, 1942, is listed as killed in action on October 24, 1944. According to a letter from Major General J. A. Ulio, the adjutant, received by his parents, Mr. and Mrs. Charles Dawson, the letter stated that Private Dawson was one of the 1,775 American war prisoners being transported from the Philippines' No. 1 prison camp north by the Japanese when the vessel was torpedoed and sunk by a submarine. The letter stated 5 of the prisoners escaped and made their way to shore in a small boat. 4 others were picked up by the Japanese boat, but the remainder of the prisoners were regarded as lost. The sinking of the ship occurred in the China Sea, slightly 200 miles from the China coast. The sinking of the ship was not announced until the first of kin had been notified. Private Dawson was not officially listed as a prisoner of war until June 1943, 14 months after the fall of Bataan. He had previously been reported missing in action. From a liberated prisoner now in the Walter Reed Hospital, the parents learned that Joe was among the able-bodied prisoners moved by the Japanese after much of Luzon had been liberated, to be used for Japanese prison labor. The liberated prisoners informed the parents, Private Dawson, that Joe was in the best of health. Prisoners physically unfit for hard prison labor were left behind to be liberated later by the Americans. The information transmitted by the adjutant was obtained from the International Red Cross. Lieutenant Carl W. Moore, pilot of the P-38 with the 8th Air Force based in England and missing since August of 44, was killed in action over Germany August 5, 1944. According to a War Department message to his mother, Miss Bruce Moore, Lieutenant Moore was graduate from the Vincennes High School, 1935, and Grinnell College in 1940. He enlisted in the Army Air Corps December 7, 1943. Another local war casualty, as announced today, Staff Sergeant Charles Curtis Lewis, who was declared missing after the fall of Corps Guider on May 7, 1942, died less than 3 months later. His mother, Miss Nanny I. Lewis, of 115 West Swartzel Avenue, was notified by the Adjutant General Edward F. Witzel, and her son died on July 21, 1942, at Kaluga, Tay Basin in the Philippine Islands as the results of beriberi. Staff Sergeant Lewis was widely known in downtown Vincennes, where he worked as a Western Union messenger boy for 3 years before enlisting in the Army in November of 1936. He previously had attended Vincennes High School. After receiving word that her son was missing almost 3.5 years ago, Miss Lewis received no further word until the recent message announcing his death of Staff Sergeant Lewis. Staff Sergeant Lewis was known to his friends here as Kurt. Beriberi is a disease caused by a deficiency thiamine or vitamin B1, and the symptoms would include he would have weakness and pain in his limbs, weight loss, impaired reflexes, symmetrical motor and sensory deficits in the extremities. Charles Henry Limbrink, born May 21, 1924 in Vincennes, Indiana, Knox County. He died in service to his country November 12, 1944. He served in the Army Air Forces, the 499th Bomb Squadron, 345th Bomb Group. Enlisted June 26, 1942. He died in action November 12, 1944. He was buried in Vincennes, Indiana at Fairview Cemetery. Private First Class David H. Neighbors, 21, a son of Mrs. Dave Amanda Neighbors of Rural Route 5, was killed in action on Luzon Island on May 8th. His mother had been notified by the War Department. He was an infantryman with the 37th Division, which went into action many months before at Bougainville and has fought all the way across the South Pacific to northern Luzon, where the outfit now is engaged in tough action there. He was a veteran of some 2.5 years in the Army. Mr. and Mrs. Herman Hartsburg of Sanborn, Rural Route 2, received a telegram from the War Department informing that their son, PFC Dewey Hartsburg, had died of wounds suffered in action on Luzon Island on February 12, 1945. PFC Hartsburg was 31 years of age and was born near Sanborn. He was the eldest of 6 sons of the family. He was educated in the Sanborn schools and had been in service 4 years, the last 15 months being overseas. Surviving are the parents and 5 brothers: Tech Sergeant Delmer Hartsburg, now in Germany; Staff Sergeant Darwin Hartsburg in the Philippines; PFC Del Hartsburg in Guam; Dwayne Hartsburg of Bicknell; and Delbert Hartsburg at home; and a sister, Miss Harold DeVore, in Indianapolis. Mr. and Mrs. Ed Hatfield of Emerson received word from the Adjutant General notifying them that their 22-year-old son, Sergeant Donald Hatfield, who was reported missing in action in the European area on October 10, 1943. The telegram came to the mother, Miss Ruth Hatfield. The word came from Germany through International Red Cross. Sergeant Hatfield was an aerial gunner on a flying fortress, which took part in a costly raid on the ball bearing works in France. Members of his family said that another fortress, damaged by gunfire, crashed into Sergeant Hatfield's ship, forcing it down. Miss Hatfield had entertained hope their son had landed safely and was a German prisoner. Sergeant Hatfield was a graduate of the Oaktown High School. He had been in the Army for 3 years and attended many aviation and gunnery schools. His brother Don has been inducted into the Navy and is scheduled to leave very soon. In addition to the parents and Don, Sergeant Hatfield is survived by 4 other brothers and sisters: Miss Betty Malott, Miss Roy Little of Vincennes, Miss Earl Weiniger, and Clarence Hatfield. Private Irvin R. Lear, 31, was killed in action on Iwo Jima on May 26, according to a message received by his wife, who resides in Bruceville, Route 1. A member of the Army Signal Corps, he was killed by shell fire while doing construction work, according to a letter received from his commanding officer, Captain Raymond Driver, of the 49th Heavy Signal Construction Battalion. He entered the Army March 17, 1944, and went overseas late in November. He was buried with full military honors in the 4th Marine Division Cemetery on Iwo Jima, Captain Driver's letter stated. Mr. and Mrs. Fred Ellerman of Route 4 in the Lutheran Church neighborhood were notified Wednesday night that their son Gilbert Ellerman had been killed in action in France August 22, 1944. He was in the Heavy Artillery Division and had been in the service for over 2 years. Before entering the service, Gilbert Ellerman had assisted his father on the farm. He attended Lutheran school. Private Henry Fernand Jassaud, born February 18, 1924 in Bicknell, Knox County, Indiana, died July 15, 1944 at the age of 20 in France. Burial was in Bicknell Memorial Cemetery. Henry was killed in the fighting that followed the invasion of Normandy. He was a member of the St. Philip Neri Catholic Church and was a graduate of the Bicknell High School. He was a private with the U.S. Army 23rd Infantry Regiment, 2nd Division. Ora C. Jack Ellis, who was in the vending machine business in Vincennes before entering the armed service, 1944. In March, was killed in action in Germany, February 3, 1945. According to a word received here by friends at Saturday night, the message from the War Department announced his death was sent to his parents, Mr. and Mrs. Sam Ellis of Owensville. They called Mr. and Mrs. Ray Halter, friends of Mr. Ellis, informing them of the message. Mr. Ellis had been overseas the past 6 months. His death orphaned his year-old child, who is living in the Ellis home, 1317 Upper 11th Street, being cared for by Miss Marceline White. The child's mother died at childbirth. Mr. and Mrs. Halter had been corresponding with Jack regularly and had been receiving on the average of 1 or 2 letters a week for him. Miss Wood Wadgen was notified by the War Department today that her son, Lieutenant James D. McDowell, was missing in action somewhere between China and India. He has been missing since May 15, 1944, the telegram said. There were no details. Lieutenant McDowell had been ferrying planes from India to China over the hazardous Himalayas, and it was reported that he was missing while flying over the hump. Lieutenant McDowell was a son of the late Mayor McDowell. His brother Sam is also in the Army and is in aviation training in Missouri. No further details was found on Lieutenant McDowell, but believe he was declared dead in action. Miss Maxine McCord had received a letter from Major General J.O. Julio, Adjutant General, informing her that her husband, Corporal Jesse W. McCord, died in Levesque, France, on October 20th as a result of wounds received in an accidental ammunition explosion. On November 2nd, 1944, she had received a telegram from the War Department announcing the death of Corporal McCord. The letter which followed gave further explanation. Corporal McCord entered the service in March 1942. He would have been overseas 1 year next March. Miss McCord lived in Vincennes, Route 4, with Miss Russell Allen, sister of Corporal McCord, who married Miss McCord's brother, Russell Allen of Washington. She had Corporal McCord here were the parents of a child less than 1 year old. Corporal McCord had never seen the child, but in all his letters expressed the keenest desire to return home after the war to his wife and child. Private First Class John A. Martindale, 31, was killed in action somewhere in Germany while serving with Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges, 1st Army. According to a War Department message received by his wife, Miss Lorraine Talbert Martindale, he was killed April 7, 1945, according to the message. PFC Martindale had been overseas since September 1944, and he received his training at Camp Van Dorn, Michigan, and Camp Mexica, Texas. He had seen service in England, Belgium, and Germany. John was born in Edwardsport, son of Mr. and Mrs. Darwin Martindale. Private Joseph E. Ostendorf, 31 years old, of Vincennes, was wounded fatally in a gunshot accident at Camp Pickett, Virginia. His wife had been informed he was a son of Edward H. Ostendorf, former city councilman. Lieutenant Carl H. Kramer, son of Mr. and Mrs. August Kramer of Bicknell, was killed, according to word received by his family. No details have been received, but the death is believed to have occurred in an accident. His last letter, dated February 19, 1945, told of returning to Hawaii after a long trip in his B-24 troop transport plane. He died February 23rd. His wife, Miss Helen Jones Kramer, whose parents, Mr. and Mrs. George D. Jones, resides in Fort Wayne, is en route home from San Francisco, where she had been living. While there she was employed by the Red Cross. She and Lieutenant Kramer were married June 6, 1944, in California. The young officer was born October 16, 1919. He was a graduate from Bicknell High School in 1937, and while in school was the captain of the basketball team. He played center for the Bulldogs. Lieutenant Kramer also attended Vincennes Business College. He received his pilot's wings at Lombard Field in Texas on February 16, 1943, and was serving with the 7th Air Force Troop Carrier Command in the Pacific. Leland Stanley Henderson, Private First Class, was killed in action overseas service May 8, 1943, according to notifications received by his father, Ralph Henderson, 1208 Park Street, from the War Department. The zone of action in which young Henderson paid a supreme sacrifice was not announced, but he had been in North Africa since a short time after Christmas and was in the battles of North African campaign. He was 24 years old, December 42. PFC Henderson is survived by his father, Ralph Henderson, grandmother, Miss Emma Edwards, 2 sisters, Rowena and Kathleen, 3 brothers, Boyd, Niall, and Robert. Robert has just joined the Army Air Corps. PFC Henderson was last heard from in March of 43. He had been in the service since January 17, 1941, and was overseas since Christmas of 42. He was one of the first to be called from Vincennes. He was formerly stationed at Fort Bliss, Texas, and Camp Hill, Virginia. Before entering the Army, he was employed at the Hamilton Glass Company plant. And in his last letter he wrote, "We're going to hurry up and win this war so we can get back to the good old US of A." Another Vincennes family has lost its second son in the armed forces. PFC Lauren J. Hartley, son of Mr. and Mrs. Thomas Hartley of 235 West Minneapolis Avenue, was killed in action in the Philippines on April 10th, according to a War Department message to his parents. The message contained no details, but said a letter of information will follow. Private Hartley had been in the Army for over 3 years and on overseas duty for 2 years. Prior to his introduction, he was employed by the People's Clothing Store. Only a short time before, Mr. and Mrs. Hartley were informed that another son, PFC William Hartley, a former employee of the Sun Commercial Mailing Department, was killed in action in Germany on March 8th. He was first reported missing. Sergeant Maurice E. Bessel of the 514 Bomber Squadron, 376 Bomber Group Heavy, United States Army Air Forces, was killed in action January 16, 1944. He is buried in Sicily, Rome, and Tunney, Italy. He was married to Myrtle L. Messel at the time. First Lieutenant Max A. Helderman, son of Mr. and Mrs. N. E. Helderman of Oaktown, has been declared dead by the War Department after being missing in action over a year. Lieutenant Helderman was a bombardier navigator in the 8th Air Force in England. He was a bombardier on the Pathfinder, a B-17 that was shot down over Freiburg, Germany, May 12, 1944. It was his 20th mission. He has been awarded the Air Medal Distinguished Flying Cross and 7 Oak Leaf clusters. He was a graduate from Washington High School and Vincennes University and taught for 2 years at Sanborn. He resigned his teaching position in April of 1942 and enlisted in the Army Air Corps. His training began at Ellington Field, Texas, February 15, 1943, and he graduated from Big Springs, Texas in July 1943. His class of 179 cadets were commissioned second lieutenants after 20 weeks training. His pilot, Captain Jimmy Knaps of Detroit, Michigan, has been released from German prison camp. He has written the Heldermans that he will tell the story when he gets home. 8 men of the crew have not been found, along with Lieutenant Colonel Marcus L. Lamley, a veteran of World War I flying, who was an intelligence officer aboard the Pathfinder on that mission. The family has received a personal message of sympathy from General A. H. Arnold of the 8th Air Force in England through a chaplain at George Field. Surviving Lieutenant Helderman and his parents, Mr. and Mrs. N. E. Helderman, and a sister, Virginia Lee Helderman. Dennis P. Coonrod, Jr. of Monroe City, had been missing in action in Europe since September 15, 1944, according to a War Department message to his wife, the former Miss Mary Slew of Vincennes. The telegram was received on Wednesday, November 8th, and contained no details. Coonrod entered the service on December 11, 1943, and received his training at Camp Walters, Texas. He went to England July 1, 1944, and arrived in France on July 18, 1944. He was the son of Mr. and Mrs. Dennis Coonrod of Monroe City. Later, with no details, it was found that Dennis Coonrod, Jr. was killed in action. Local relatives learned that Private Oscar P. Oxman, former Knox County prosecutor, was killed in action on a battlefield in France, August 12, 1944. He was an infantryman and had been in the Army since November 10, 1943. His outfit was one of the first to enter Normandy on D-Day, and he had been in France since. As Knox County prosecutor in 1939 and 1940, and continued prominent in Republican Party affairs since. He was born August 28, 1914, a son of Albert Oxman Sr. and the late Louise Sager Oxman. He lived at Purcell Station, south of Vincennes, as a boy, and received his elementary education at St. Peter's Lutheran School. He graduated from Decker High School, attended University of Illinois for 2 years, and then attended Washington Law School at Washington, D.C., where he received a law degree 3 years later. Still later, he took postgraduate work as a public accountant at Chicago. The last words local relatives had from him was a letter which he wrote from France on August 8th. In a letter he wrote, "Let it be known that I am doing my part in this war. We march many miles a day, dig 2 or 3 foxholes a day, and get about 4 hours sleep a day. We get washed at some farm home every 2 or 3 days, and a shave about once a week. Most of the time, we get so tired we don't care to do anything." General MacArthur expresses sympathy to the widow of local soldier Miss Fannie Mae Hunter of Durham, North Carolina, has received a letter from General Douglas MacArthur expressing his sympathy and regret at the death of her husband, PFC Ralph N. Hunter, who was killed in action in New Guinea on July 13, 1944. Another letter to Miss Hunter from Captain Neil Taylor, commanding officer of Private Hunter's company, contained details of his death and all the affections he held among all the officers and the men of his company. The letter from General MacArthur follows. Dear Miss Hunter, in the death of your husband, Private First Class Ralph N. Hunter, I have lost a gallant comrade in arms, and I cannot express to you the potency of my regret. His service under me in the Southwest Pacific was characterized by his complete devotion to our beloved country and by his death in his crusade for freedom and liberty. He is enshrined in its imperishable glory. Very faithfully signed, Douglas MacArthur. Following is a copy of the Captain Taylor's letter. Dear Miss Hunter, I wish to express a sympathy for the loss of your fine husband, Ralph, from action with the enemy. He died while under my command, and because of the affection he held among all the officers and men of this company, I feel that in some respect I share your sorrow. Ralph died gallantly, going forward with his comrades against the enemy. He was killed instantly by a bullet wound, and he was given honorable burial in the attendance of friends who knew him best. Ralph was a fine soldier, and indeed a man his country could be proud to call its own. I am certainly proud to have served and fought with him. Again, and on the behalf of the entire company, I offer my deepest sympathy. Any information you desire about the disposition of his personal effects, the place of burial will be furnished when security permits by the Quartermaster General, Washington, D.C. Sincerely signed, Neil Taylor, Captain Infantry. Private Hunter is a son, John Hunter of Bicknell. Tech 5 Ralph Fuzzy Hurst was killed in action in Germany on April 5, 1945. His wife, Miss Juanita Hurst of Vincennes, was informed by a War Department telegram which arrived. Miss Hurst had been informed that he was missing in action, but earlier that Monday, Miss Hurst had received a message from a friend of her husband, a postmaster in his battalion of the 65th Infantry Regiment, which was part of the Third Army in Germany, in which some of the Tech 5 Hurst harrowing experiences of April 5th was described. He was serving as a chauffeur for Lieutenant Colonel Weigel. At the time, she learned the following is quoted from the message she received. Tech 5 J. Ralph Hurst, Headquarters Company, 1st Battalion, distinguished himself by heroic achievement while driving Lieutenant Colonel Weigel. Lieutenant Colonel Weigel and Tech 5 Hurst were proceeding along the road near Mulhausen as they neared the small bridge over the Buschhausen River. Enemy machine gun fire fell upon them from the rear. Instantly, Tech 5 Hurst speeded the vehicle and swerved the corner. 500 yards further down the road, they were again caught by machine gun fire from the right flank. As Tech 5 Hurst zigzagged the Jeep, 7 enemy riflemen appeared in the clearing near them and opened fire. Suddenly the Jeep burst into flames. A bullet struck the windshield of the Jeep and went past Tech 5 Hurst's head. Lieutenant Colonel Weigel was struck in the leg and elbow by machine gun fire. With calm and cool mind, Hurst took complete command of the situation. Suddenly grasping the wheel of the Jeep, he drove the flaming vehicle through a gauntlet of enemy fire. A short distance further, as he drove the vehicle through a steel fence barrier into the yard of a house he had noticed civilians occupying, there he lifted Lieutenant Colonel Weigel from the Jeep and carried him into the house and ordered the occupants to administer first aid. Tech 5 Hurst voluntarily set out in the directions from which they had come to seek means of transporting Lieutenant Colonel Weigel across the river to the battalion's aid station. The calm, collected manner and steady nerve by which Tech 5 Hurst commanded the situation was in no small way responsible for Lieutenant Colonel Weigel's escaping alive of the enemy ambush, and for the timely administering of first aid to Lieutenant Colonel Weigel's wounds. Tech 5 Hurst has been recommended for an award. The message further said that at the time Tech 5 Hurst left Lieutenant Colonel Weigel, he was not injured, but that later his Jeep was found with all his personal belongings gone. This message arrived only a few hours before Miss Hurst received notice of the fact that her husband had been killed. Tech 5 Hurst was widely known and popular in Vincennes and vicinity. Miss Mahilda Dunn of 514 South 4th Street had received a letter from Major General Edward F. Witzel, acting adjutant, giving more details concerning the death of her son, Corporal Richard J. Dunn of the U.S. Air Corps, who died September 14, 1945. On Iwo Jima, he met his death as a result of injuries incurred when a road grader struck a Jeep in which he was riding, the letter said. The letter expressed sympathy to the mother. Miss Dunn had previously been informed that Corporal Dunn had been killed. On September 13th, Corporal Dunn wrote to his mother, telling her not to send any Christmas presents this year, as he would be sailing for home by Christmas. Richard had been in the service for 3 years and overseas 3 years in September. While in school here, he was employed by the East Side Market and later was a truck driver for J.B. Coogan. When he entered the service, he was employed by the Wallace Produce Company. He was 31 years old. Surviving, besides the mother, are a sister, Miss Margaret Dunn, with the Decker Fox Insurance Agency, and 2 brothers, Eddie Dunn with the Opel Bakery, and James in the U.S. Navy on a destroyer, somewhere in the Japanese waters. Private First Class Richard Johnson, recently killed in action in Italy, has been awarded posthumously the Order of the Purple Heart, according to word received by his mother, Miss Charles Johnson of Ragsdale, from Henry L. Simonson, Secretary of War. The letter follows. My dear Miss Johnson, you will shortly receive the Purple Heart Medal, which has been posthumously awarded by the direction of the President to your son, PFC Richard Johnson, Infantry. It is sent as a tangible expression of the country's gratitude for his gallantry and devotion. It is sent you as well, with my deepest personal sympathy for your bereavement. The loss of a loved one is beyond man's repairing, and the medal is of slight value, not so, however, the message it carries. We are all comrades in arms in the battle for a country, and those who have gone are not yet and never will be forgotten. By those of us who remain, I hope you will accept the medal in evidence of such remembrance. At this same time, Miss Johnson received a card from George C. Marshall, Chief of Staff, U.S. Army, commending the gallantry and valor of her son. Miss Suzanne Schwartzman Offutt received a telegram from the War Department announcing that her husband, Sergeant Robert Offutt, was killed on June 23, 1945. No details of Sergeant Offutt's death were learned. He had been stationed in Italy, where he served with a headquarters company of the 5th Air Force. Presumably, he still had that assignment. Sergeant Offutt, formerly widely known as a star football and basketball player and an expert competitive swimmer, had been overseas about a year. He only recently was promoted to the rank of sergeant. While in high school, he was center on the football team and a tower of strength at that position for several years. He was a guard on the basketball team for 3 years and equally prominent there. He competed with Vincennes YMCA swimming team at many meets and helped that team win extensive honors. He leaves a wife and 2 daughters, Patricia and Penny, here. Sergeant Offutt's parents are Mr. and Mrs. H.C. Offutt of Robinson, Illinois. The Army has listed First Lieutenant Ruel Howard Miller of near Emerson as killed in action. A B-24 pilot, Lieutenant Miller, first was reported missing in action when he was unreported after a raid over Austria, July 16, 1944. Lieutenant Miller was a son of Mr. and Mrs. Otto Miller near Emerson and a graduate of Oaktown High School. He had been overseas for about 2 years, and he was flying from a base in Italy. Valentine George Fries, Jr. was born January 6, 1922 in Vincennes, Knox County, Indiana, to Valentine Valley George Fries, Sr. and Marie Louise Wasman. Valentine Fries joined the military September 26, 1942 and was killed in action April 12, 1944 at Dunkirk. He is buried in Vincennes, Indiana, Knox County at Mount Calvary Cemetery. Sergeant Vernon Houchin, killed in action. His wife, Georgia, resides in 115 West Swartzel Avenue, was killed in action in Germany on February 3rd, according to a War Department message received. He previously had been reported missing in Belgium. Sergeant Houchins, son of Mr. and Mrs. Dello Houchins of Gleason, Indiana, entered the service in December of 1942. He trained at Camp Van Dorn, Mississippi, Camp Maxey, Texas, before going overseas in September. 2 Vincennes men have been killed in action on Luzon. They are Sergeant Walter Butler, son of Mr. and Mrs. Ethel Butler, who was killed on February 27, 1945, and Staff Sergeant Harry L. Fraker, son of Mrs. H. Woods of Vincennes, to whom the Purple Heart was awarded posthumously. Sergeant Fraker died on Luzon January 24th. Sergeant Butler attended grade school and high school here and entered the Army in 1942. Having served overseas for 2 years, he is the brother of Mrs. Joe Myers of 1320 Prairie Street. Staff Sergeant Fraker was inducted in 1941 and was stationed at the Field Artillery Replacement Center, Fort Bragg, North Carolina, until July 1944, when he was transferred to the infantry and sent to New Guinea. His wife, Myra Pickering Fraker, and their little daughter, Sandra Sue, reside in Evansville. Mr. and Mrs. Thomas Hartley of 235 West Minneapolis Avenue received a telegram from the War Department announcing that their son, PFC William G. Hartley, was killed in action in Germany. PFC Hartley entered the Army a year and a half ago. He previously had been employed in the mailing department of the Sun Commercial that summer before he went overseas as a member of the infantry division. On October 10th of 45, he was wounded, and later his parents here received a Purple Heart which had been awarded to him. The parents received word that he was missing in action on March 8th. Then came the telegram announcing his death. Robert B. Bell, son of Miss Mary E. Bell, member of the U.S. Tank Division fighting in France, was killed in action August 6, 1944. According to a telegram received by his mother. The message gave no further details. Robert was the son of the late Charles L. Bob Bell, captain at No. 3 Hose Station, who died unexpectedly about 2 years ago of a heart attack while on duty at the fire station. Robert was a graduate of Vincennes Lincoln High School and a star member of the basketball team during his last 2 years in school. Robert entered service about the same time in late January or early February 1942. He was first stationed at Camp Knox, Kentucky, and later transferred to camp in West Virginia. He had been overseas more than a year. Private Jim Brock, Alice athlete killed in action. Private James Henry Brock of Vincennes and the 3rd Armored Division was killed in action in Belgium January 13, 1945, and no more details are available at the time. Private Brock is a son of Miss Margaret S. Brock and a grandson of James T. Brock of 1317 Scott. May of 1944 from Vincennes Lincoln High School, where he was a member of several seasons of the track and field team as a mile runner. He was awarded his V letter the spring before for his track performance. On June 29th, a month after his graduation from high school, he entered the service and received basic training at Fort McClellan in Alabama. He was home for a furlough November of 44, leaving here November 21st of 44, and shortly afterwards going overseas. A single letter was received from him after he left his country, and in the letter he revealed how he had spent Christmas Eve and Christmas Day in a boxcar in France with sea rations for Christmas dinner. PSC Harold M. Atkins, U.S. infantryman with the Patton's Army, was killed in action in France according to a telegram received by his wife, Miss Effie M. Atkins, 1601 Minter Street. The telegram informed Miss Atkins that she would be given further information when available. He had been overseas since early in July, leaving his country June 29th. On October 10, 44, his wife received a telegram informing her that PFC Atkins had been wounded in action in France on September 18th. However, he recovered shortly and went back into active service. W.J. Bovichin, Bicknell soldier killed in action. PFC Willis James Bovichin, son of Mr. and Mrs. Julius Bovichin of Bicknell, was killed in action on Christmas Day while serving with the 101st Airborne Division in Europe. According to a War Department telegram to his family, Private Bovichin, a native of Linton, attended school in Linton and Bicknell and graduated from Wheatland High School. He was 36 years old. He entered the service in March 1942 and received his training at Camp Claiborne in Louisiana and at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. He went overseas in August 1943. Then his survivors would have included his parents and 2 brothers, Charles Bovichin, Chicago, and Staff Sergeant Carl Bovichin with the Army in Belgium. Miss Audie Cooper of 216 Wheatland Avenue, Bicknell, whose son, PFC Leonard O. Cooper, died on July 4, 1945, of a wound received on Luzon in the Philippines, received a letter from her son's captain describing the circumstances under which the son received his fatal wound. The letter said that PFC Cooper, who was a member of the famous 38th Cyclone Division, volunteered to help establish an ambush for the Japanese. He joined the patrol, went out, and set the ambush. The ambush was successful, returned to camp near Angeles Pampango on Luzon while unloading a machine gun. The weapon discharged, striking PFC Cooper. He became unconscious and was given medical attention at once by a medical officer present. Despite efforts to preserve his life, he died 20 minutes later without regaining consciousness. His death occurred at 1:30 p.m. on July 4, 1945. The following day, he was buried with military honors in the United States Armed Forces Cemetery, No. 2, grave number 1895, row number 15, plat number 1 in Manila on Luzon. The services were conducted at the grave by Chaplain Hardy. Sergeant C.R. Klinkenbeard lost his life in a crash of an Army airplane near Gowan Field, Idaho, and from that field where he had been stationed, the body was escorted to Freelandville by Sergeant Jack Bruner.